Moshe ben Maimon, or Musa ibn Maimon, acronymed Rambam, and Latinized Moses Maimonides, a preeminent medieval Sephardic Jewish philosopher and astronomer, became one of the most prolific and influential Torah scholars and physicians of the Middle Ages. Born in Cordova, Almoravid Empire on Passover Eve, 1135 or 1138, he died in Egypt on December 12, 1204, whence his body was taken to the Lower Galilee and buried in Tiberias. He worked as a rabbi, physician, and philosopher in Morocco and Egypt. During his lifetime, most Jews greeted Maimonides' writings on Jewish law and ethics with acclaim and gratitude, even as far away as Iraq and Yemen. And although Maimonides rose to become the revered head of the Jewish community in Egypt, there were also vociferous critics of some of his writings, particularly in Spain. Nonetheless, he was posthumously acknowledged as among the foremost rabbinical arbiters and philosophers in Jewish history, and his copious work comprises a cornerstone of Jewish scholarship. His 14-volume Mishneh Torah still carries significant canonical authority as a codification of Talmudic law. In the yeshiva world, he is called sometimes Ha-Nesher Ha-Gadol, in recognition of his outstanding status as a bona fide exponent of the oral Torah. Aside from being revered by Jewish historians, Maimonides also figures very prominently in the history of Islamic and Arab sciences and is mentioned extensively in studies influenced by Avicenna, Averroes and Al-Farabi. He in his turn influenced other prominent Arab and Muslim philosophers and scientists. He became a prominent philosopher and polymath in both the Jewish and Islamic worlds. Name. His full Hebrew name is Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, whose acronym forms Rambam. His full Arabic name is Abu Imran Musa bin Maimon bin Ubaydallah al-Kurtabi, or Musa bin Maimon for short. In Latin, the Hebrew ben becomes the Greek minus style suffix ides to form Moses Maimonides. Biography. Maimonides was born in Córdoba during what some scholars consider to be the end of the golden age of Jewish culture in the Iberian Peninsula, after the first centuries of the Moorish rule. At an early age, he developed an interest in sciences and philosophy. He read those Greek philosophers accessible in Arabic translations, and was deeply immersed in the sciences and learning of Islamic culture. Though the Gaonic tradition, especially in its North African version, formed the basis of his legal thought, some scholars have argued in the 21st century that Muslim law, including Almohad legal thought, also had a substantial influence. Maimonides was not known as a supporter of mysticism, although a strong intellectual type of mysticism has been discerned in his philosophy. He expressed disapproval of poetry, the best of which he declared to be false, since it was founded on pure invention. This sage, who was revered for his personality as well as for his writings, led a busy life, and wrote many of his works while traveling or in temporary accommodation. Maimonides studied Torah under his father Maimon, who had in turn studied under Rabbi Joseph ibn Migash, a student of Isaac al-Fizi. A Berber dynasty, the Almohads, conquered Córdoba in 1148, and abolished the dhimmi status in some of their territories. The loss of this protected status threatened the Jewish and Christian communities with conversion to Islam, death, or exile. The historical records of abuses against Jews in the immediate post-1148 period are subject to different interpretations. Many Jews were forced to convert, but due to suspicion by the authorities of fake conversions, the new converts had to wear identifying clothing that set them apart and made them subject to public scrutiny. Maimonides' family, along with most other Jews, chose exile. Some say, though, that it is likely that Maimonides feigned a conversion to Islam before escaping. This forced conversion was ruled legally invalid under Islamic law when brought up by a rival in Egypt. For the next 10 years, Maimonides moved about in southern Spain, eventually settling in Fez in Morocco. During this time, he composed his acclaimed commentary on the Mishnah in the years 1166 to 1168. Following this sojourn in Morocco, together with 2 sons, he sojourned in the Holy Land, before settling in Fustat, Egypt around 1168. While in Cairo, he studied in a yeshiva attached to a small synagogue. In the Holy Land, he prayed at the Temple Mount. He wrote that this day of visiting the Temple Mount was a day of holiness for him and his descendants. Maimonides shortly thereafter was instrumental in helping rescue Jews taken captive during the Christian king Amalric's siege of the Egyptian town of Bilbis. He sent 5 letters to the Jewish communities of Lower Egypt asking them to pool money together to pay the ransom. The money was collected and then given to 2 judges sent to Palestine to negotiate with the Crusaders. The captives were eventually released. Following this triumph, the Maimonides family, hoping to increase their wealth, gave their savings to his brother, the youngest son David ben Maimon, a merchant. Maimonides directed his brother to procure goods only at the Sudanese port of Idib. After a long arduous trip through the desert, however, David was unimpressed by the goods on offer there. Against his brother's wishes, David boarded a ship for India, since great wealth was to be found in the east. Before he could reach his destination, David drowned at sea sometime between 1169 to 1170. The death of his brother caused Maimonides to become sick with grief. In a letter, he wrote, "The greatest misfortune that has befallen me during my entire life, worse than anything else, was the demise of the saint, may his memory be blessed, who drowned in the Indian Sea, carrying much money belonging to me, him, and to others, and left with me a little daughter and a widow. On the day I received that terrible news I fell ill and remained in bed for about a year, suffering from a sore boil, fever, and depression, and was almost given up. About 8 years have passed, but I am still mourning and unable to accept consolation. And how should I console myself? He grew up on my knees, he was my brother, and he was my student." Around 1171, Maimonides was appointed the Najid of the Egyptian Jewish community. Arabist S.D. Goitin believes the leadership he displayed during the ransoming of the Crusader captives led to this appointment. With the loss of the family funds tied up in David's business venture, Maimonides assumed the vocation of physician, for which he was to become famous. He had trained in medicine in both Cordoba and in Fez. Gaining widespread recognition, he was appointed court physician to the Grand Vizier Al-Qaidi al-Fadl, then to Sultan Saladin, after whose death he remained a physician to the royal family. In his medicinal writings, Maimonides described many conditions, including asthma, diabetes, hepatitis, and pneumonia, and he emphasized moderation and a healthy lifestyle. His treatises became influential for generations of physicians. He was knowledgeable about Greek and Arabic medicine, and followed the principles of humorism in the tradition of Galen. He did not blindly accept authority but used his own observation and experience. Julia Bess-Frank indicates that Maimonides in his medical writings sought to interpret works of authorities so that they could become acceptable. Maimonides displayed in his interactions with patients attributes that today would be called intercultural awareness and respect for the patient's autonomy. Although he frequently wrote of his longing for solitude in order to come closer to God and to extend his reflections, elements considered essential in his philosophy to the prophetic experience, he gave over most of his time to caring for others. In a famous letter, Maimonides describes his daily routine. "I would go to heal them, and write prescriptions for their illnesses, until the evening, and I would be extremely weak." As he goes on to say in this letter, even on the Sabbath he would receive members of the community. It is remarkable that he managed to write extended treatises, including not only medical and other scientific studies but some of the most systematically thought through and influential treatises on Halakha and Jewish philosophy of the Middle Ages. In 1173 quarters, Maimonides wrote his famous Cigarette to Man. It has been suggested that his incessant travail undermined his own health and brought about his death at 69. His rabbinic writings are valued as fundamental and unparalleled resources for religious Jews today. Maimonides died on December 12, 1204 in Fustat. It is widely believed that he was briefly buried in the study room of the synagogue courtyard, and that, soon after, in accordance with his wishes, his remains were exhumed and taken to Tiberias, where he was reinterred. The tomb of Maimonides on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee in Israel marks his grave. This location for his final resting place has been debated, for in the Jewish Kyrene community, a tradition holds that he remained buried in Egypt. Maimonides and his wife, the daughter of Mishal ben Yeshayahu Halevi, had one child who survived into adulthood, Abraham, who became recognized as a great scholar. He succeeded Maimonides as Najid and as court physician at the age of 18. Throughout his career, he defended his father's writings against all critics. The office of Najid was held by the Maimonides family for 4 successive generations until the end of the 14th century. The philosopher, doctor is widely respected in Spain, and a statue of him was erected in Córdoba near to the only synagogue in that city to escape destruction during years of persecution. Although it no longer functions as a Jewish house of worship, it is open to the public. Maimonides is sometimes said to be a descendant of King David, although he never made such a claim. Influence. Maimonides' Mishneh Torah is considered by traditionalist non-Ashkenazi Jews even today as one of the chief authoritative codifications of Jewish law and ethics. It is exceptional for its logical construction, concise and clear expression, and extraordinary learning, so that it became a standard against which other later codifications were often measured. It is still closely studied in rabbinic yeshivot. A popular medieval saying that also served as his epitaph states, "From Moshe to Moshe there was none like Moshe." It chiefly referred to his rabbinic writings. But Maimonides was also one of the most influential figures in medieval Jewish philosophy. His brilliant adaptation of Aristotelian thought to biblical faith deeply impressed later Jewish thinkers, and had an unexpected immediate historical impact. Some more acculturated Jews in the century that followed his death, particularly in Spain, sought to apply Maimonides' Aristotelianism in ways that undercut traditionalist belief and observance, giving rise to an intellectual controversy in Spanish and southern French Jewish circles. The intensity of debate spurred Catholic Church interventions against heresy, and a general confiscation of rabbinic texts. In reaction, the more radical interpretations of Maimonides were defeated, at least amongst Ashkenazi Jews. There was a tendency to ignore his specifically philosophical writings and to stress instead the rabbinic and halakhic writings. These writings often included considerable philosophical chapters or discussions in support of halakhic observance. David Hartman observes that Maimonides clearly expressed the traditional support for a philosophical understanding of God both in the Agadah of Talmud and in the behavior of the Hasid, the pious Jew. Maimonidean thought continues to influence traditionally observant Jews. The most rigorous medieval critique of Maimonides is Hasdai Crescas's or Adonai. Crescas bucked the eclectic trend by demolishing the certainty of the Aristotelian worldview, not only in religious matters but also in the most basic areas of medieval science. Crescas's critique provoked a number of 15th-century scholars to write defenses of Maimonides. A partial translation of Crescas was produced by Harry Ostrom-Wolfson of Harvard University in 1929. Because of his path-finding synthesis of Aristotle and biblical faith, Maimonides had a fundamental influence on the great Christian theologian St. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas refers specifically to Maimonides in several of his works, including the commentary on the sentences, 13 Principles of Faith. In his commentary on the Mishnah, Maimonides formulates his 13 principles of faith. They summarized what he viewed as the required beliefs of Judaism: the existence of God, God's unity and indivisibility into elements, God's spirituality and incorporeality, God's eternity. God alone should be the object of worship, revelation through God's prophets, the preeminence of Moses among the prophets. The Torah that we have today is the one dictated to Moses by God. The Torah given by Moses will not be replaced, and that nothing may be added or removed from it. God's awareness of all human actions and thoughts, reward of good and punishment of evil, becoming of the Jewish Messiah, the resurrection of the dead. Maimonides compiled the principles from various Talmudist sources. These principles were controversial when first proposed, evoking criticism by rabbis Hastei Kreskas and Joseph Albo, and were effectively ignored by much of the Jewish community for the next few centuries. However, these principles have become widely held. Today, Orthodox Judaism holds these beliefs to be obligatory. Two poetic restatements of these principles eventually became canonized in many editions of the Siddur, legal works. With Mishneh Torah, Maimonides composed a code of Jewish law with the widest possible scope and depth. The work gathers all the binding laws from the Talmud, and incorporates the positions of the Geonim. While Mishneh Torah is now considered the forerunner of the Arba Torim and the Shulchan Aruch, it met initially with much opposition. There were two main reasons for this opposition. First, Maimonides had refrained from adding references to his work for the sake of brevity. Second, in the introduction, he gave the impression of wanting to cut out study of the Talmud to arrive at a conclusion in Jewish law. Although Maimonides later wrote that this was not his intent, his most forceful opponents were the rabbis of Provence, and a running critique by Rabbi Abraham ben David is printed in virtually all editions of Mishneh Torah. It was still recognized as a monumental contribution to the systemized writing of Halakha. Throughout the centuries, it has been widely studied, and its halakhic decisions have weighed heavily in later rulings. In response to those who would attempt to force followers of Maimonides and his Mishneh Torah to abide by the rulings of his own Shulchan Aruch or other later works, Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote, "Who would dare force communities who follow the Rambam to follow any other decisor, early or late? The Rambam is the greatest of the decisors, and all the communities of the land of Israel and the Arabistan and the Maghreb practice according to his word, and accepted him as their rabbi." An oft-cited legal maxim from his pen is, "It is better and more satisfactory to acquit 1,000 guilty persons than to put a single innocent one to death." He argued that executing a defendant on anything less than absolute certainty would lead to a slippery slope of decreasing burdens of proof, until we would be convicting merely according to the judge's caprice. Scholars specializing in the study of the history and subculture of Judaism in pre-modern China have noted surprising similarities between this work and the liturgy of the Kaifeng Jews, descendants of Persian merchants who settled in the Middle Kingdom during the early Song dynasty. Beyond scriptural similarities, Michael Pollack comments the Jews' Pentateuch was divided into 53 sections according to the Persian style. He also points out, there is no proof, to be sure, that Kaifeng Jewry ever had direct access to the works of the Great Eagle, but it would have had ample time and opportunity to acquire or become acquainted with them well before its reservoir of Jewish learning began to run out. Nor do the Maimonidean leanings of the Kehillah contradict the historical evidence that has the Jews arriving in Kaifeng no later than 1126. The year in which the Sung fled the city, and 9 years before Maimonides was born. In 1163, when the Kehillah built the first of its synagogues, Maimonides was only 28 years old, so that it is highly unlikely that even his earliest authoritative teachings could by then have reached China. Charity. One of the most widely referred to sections of the Mishneh Torah is the section dealing with tzedakah. In Hilkot Matanot Aniyim, chapter 10-7-14, Maimonides lists his famous 8 levels of giving: giving an interest-free loan to a person in need, forming a partnership with a person in need, giving a grant to a person in need, finding a job for a person in need, so long as that loan, grant, partnership, or job results in the person no longer living by relying upon others. Giving tzedakah anonymously to an unknown recipient via a person which is trustworthy, wise, and can perform acts of tzedakah with your money in a most impeccable fashion. Giving tzedakah anonymously to a known recipient. Giving tzedakah publicly to an unknown recipient. Giving tzedakah before being asked. Giving adequately after being asked. Giving willingly, but inadequately. Giving in sadness. It is thought that Maimonides was referring to giving because of the sad feelings one might have in seeing people in need. Other translations say, giving unwillingly.